much worse problem than ours in our economy. We have accelerating growth. We have direct financial investment that would come in, except for the weak dollar policy of the United States prevents the foreign direct investment that we ought to be seeing.
So it sounds like what you're describing would possibly create some inflation in terms of boosting commodity prices. Are you considering that at this point? Are you worried about that?
Well, the Federal Reserve wants to have, they want to inflate house prices upward, but the house overhang of unsold homes is so large that what we have is we see land prices rising. I've got farmland in southwest Kansas, and my goodness, the price has doubled in the last 3 years. So the Fed will succeed in inflating prices until it overcomes the overhang of unsold homes, and we thereby get an improving house price market.
Did this action yesterday by central banks make it safer in the financial markets?
Yes, it certainly did.
So it achieved in some ways that attention from your perspective, but very interesting to hear you warn of some of the unanticipated consequences. We'll continue to watch those, and I'd love to talk to you again about them, Wayne. Thanks for making time today.
All right, how many of you put unanticipated?
Okay, well, it's good to be with you, and good luck to everyone.
All right, so I was just curious how many of you put unanticipated. That was kind of a good sneaky one there at the end. All right, so little old Wayne Angel from Ottawa University. All right, pass your papers into the middle for extra credit. That was our dose of Wayne. So pretty much regularly he has been on the news like that, little interviews, probably on average monthly for 20 years. So he's quite the dynamo that way.
He's still around?
Yeah, he's still alive, but yeah, he's very retired, let's put it that way at this point. So he's not doing those sorts of interviews anymore.
Do you ever come visit the school?
Yeah, we had him here for some special events
Cool.
back in the day. Yeah, that was awesome. Well, what the heck? Why am I not getting into my thing? Did I change my password? Oh, okay.
It's cap locks over to?
All right, I wanted to go over the test sheet. So pass all your extra credit forward. Maybe up to, we'll get it up to Mary or Jesse, I guess, either way, whatever. Okay, so there's the grade sheet, if you guys have hopefully looked it over. And so it's got all of your grades. I've got you sorted from high score in the class to low score. And I just did a 90, 80, 70, 60. And so it looks like some of you got some late homework, those of you at the bottom. Since I'm an economist, I like to look at the data here. What do you notice about this bottom half versus even the middle C's here? If you analyze that data, what do you notice down here, looking at the data versus like up here? What are there more of? A lot of zeros. Do your freaking work. Do it late even if you need to, right? Contact me. I shouldn't be getting this many F's and D's. You guys need to kind of catch up some of that stuff. So this is the total. So the good news is we still have quite a few points left, including the final exam and our project, which we'll talk about next week. And then you've got the scores. So the sheet is with 470 points, which I think was through week 5 since you had completed week 5, and the midterm score on there. So, any questions?
You don't account for like extra credit in these until
Not until the very end, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, extra credits at the end. And so, if any of you want to see your exam, you can come and see me after class or on office hours. We can set up a time, whatever works. All right, so today we march on with some federal. Oh, whoa, did I just shut that off? I did. I did want to show you one more thing here. I forgot. Oh, I don't even have it. Must have left it in my office. Okay, that's all right. We'll do it next time. We'll look at it tomorrow. Okay, so we were looking at the structure of the Federal Reserve yesterday, and how many Federal Reserve banks are there? Yeah, Simon, or a question?
Yeah, I have a question. What is our
The project is not a video project this time, so that is due at the end of the term. We'll go over the details with it next week. So we haven't even really gotten to the content yet that it's going to be about. So it's different than what it was for micro.
How many points will that be worth?
40, and that's on your sheet there too, and it'll show the number of points that is there. So it's 40. And yeah, have fun, do the project. That should be some relatively easy points for you to get to. Okay, anything else on the grade sheet or points? Okay, so back to Federal Reserve. How many Federal Reserve banks are there? 12. Okay, so where we left off yesterday was talking about the Federal Open Market Committee, and that's a committee of people that is there to help set policy. They meet regularly about every 6 weeks and determine the direction they want to head. It's led by the chair of the Federal Reserve, and the chair currently is Jerome Powell, and he's been leading the Fed now through even the Trump administration at the turnover. So he's been there for quite a while, and they have a 4-year renewable term, so they're able to kind of stay in there for a longer period of time as the leader. All right, so what are the policies of the Fed? So these are the monetary policy tools. So how does the Fed change the money supply? So change in the money supply, we kind of use this notation. The triangle always is kind of our math notation for change. How does the Fed change the money supply? So we have kind of 4 tools that the Fed uses to change the money supply. 4 tools of the Fed. And some of this has changed over time, but the tools are still there in theory. So number 1 is they can set an interest rate called the discount rate. So a change in the discount rate. Okay, so the discount rate, this is the interest rate charged to banks for short-term loans. Short-term loans from the Fed. So remember, the bank, the Federal Reserve Bank is the banker's bank, and so they can go to their bank, so to speak, the Fed, and get a loan. And so it used to be for banks that were in trouble, and then they kind of modified that over time. They tried to smooth it over and say, oh, it's okay for you to come and get a loan from us. So that's changed over time as well. But if they fall short on reserves, they set ready to lend them money. And so one example of that was the Silicon Valley Bank here recently, a couple of years ago that we talked about. Silicon Valley Bank run. Right, so the Fed loaned money so that depositors did not lose. Or they were able to get their money out of the bank if they chose to. Unfortunately, this is yet another example of an abuse of power by the government. What was the maximum amount that your money's insured for that we learned yesterday? We went over it twice over the last 2 days, I think. 250,000, good. So it's 250,000 bucks. So basically, if you have $500,000 basically sitting in cash, you're pretty rich, or maybe you're retired and you just want to keep it in an account for whatever reason, you should put your money in two different banks. So if you put 250 at Wells Fargo and 250 at Chase Manhattan Bank, then you're covered if either one of those banks go through. But if you put all 500,000 into Wells Fargo, then you have 250 at risk. The Federal Reserve would cover up to 250 of your $500,000 deposit, but not beyond it. Well, this is where I think the government was dumb. And when Silicon Valley Bank went under, there was some people, some of the Silicon Valley high-tech places that had deposits of like $2 to $5 million. And Joe Biden got on the TV and said, we're going to stand by you to make sure you're flush, and Jerome Powell. And so they basically said, forget about our rule of law that says 250 is the maximum. We got you covered, baby. Now, you guys might think that that sounds nice, right? Oh, isn't our government being nice when people make? But they were stupid. And stupid people should lose their money, right? That's the way I look at it. Why was the bank presidents allowing deposits? So there's a mechanism in place called a sweep account that I learned about a long time ago, where if you have 500,000 in a bank, they can leave 250, and at the end of the day, 5 p.m., they sweep out the excess over 250, and they loan it to other banks. So it's called a sweep account. And that way, if that bank ever goes under, that money is still available out there in the form of other assets. So it's called a sweep account. So there was already a mechanism in place to do this, but they weren't doing it. Why did they not do it? Because they probably thought, oh, the government will bail me out or whatever, right? So this idea of government bailouts is something I don't agree with. I think it's caused a lot of havoc in our system, and it erodes the rule of law and starts to look like some other countries where whatever the leader of the country does is what the law of the day is. Imagine how awful the United States would be if we go from Biden to Trump to Obama to Bush to you go down the road, and then their particular agenda is what the new law of the land is, right? It wouldn't make you as an entrepreneur want to invest for a 20-year, 30-year project, right? If you knew that some other leader might come in and the tax rates go from 30% to 60% or 70%, right? Or somehow you lose your property because they confiscate anybody's property who has more than $1 million worth of property or something. They create some stupid law. We need a stable rule of law to have a healthy, growing economy. And so there's been some things here lately, especially through the COVID crisis and even before that. I mean, we can go back to the financial crisis, by the way. We don't have this is back to the Obama years and the 2008 financial crisis. this kind of stuff goes on. It doesn't matter what party's in office. We've been slowly eroding the rule of law and making exceptions to these laws that are there for a certain reason, so that we, have some order in these big markets, especially in the financial markets. Okay, questions or comments, Aaron? Yeah, Jesse.
How often does the government save companies like they did with the bank, I guess?
When the crisis comes, that's what's sad, even this last one. So the bailouts, the loans to General Motors and the major auto companies, they should have went under. People would say, oh, but Russ, you're so mean, they're going to lose their jobs. Not for very long, because Ford Motor Company was very solid at the time. So if one of the General Motors goes down, and now we have a big manufacturing plant, do you think Ford might want to jump in there and start making some cars if they're successful? Yeah. Some of those people are out of a job for maybe a month or 2 months or 3 months, or eventually we reorganized. But why would we put the tax dollars at risk, and kind of more importantly give this signal that, hey, the government's always here to bail you out. It doesn't matter what you do. We'll keep you alive. Because who are we keeping alive? The rich people or the poor people? The rich people. It's sad to me. I care about the poor people around the country, and so there's been a lot of things that have gone more to the detriment of the poor people than it has the rich people. So we got to be mindful of some of that stuff. All right, so discount rate is one of the things. So changing the discount rate is one tool. Number 2 is a change in the required reserve ratio, the little R that we talked about yesterday. Oh, sorry, I did want to come back to, I'll do that here. I wanted to give you guys the direction here. So if the Federal Reserve raises the discount rate, so interest rates are kind of being pushed up, is there going to be more loans or less loans going on in society? More loans or less when interest rates are high? Less. Why were you thinking more, Justin? I'm glad you voiced your opinion, so you get extra credit for a wrong answer.
So I was thinking interest for, I was thinking like savings, that kind of.
Okay, yeah, that's the thing, that's why I wanted you to get your extra credit point for the wrong answer. So there are two sides of the market, right? So yeah, you got the savers, and then you've got the people who are borrowing. And so yeah, you might be thinking, hey, if I get a higher interest rate, I want to save more money, right? And that's true. That's true in general. But as interest rates go up, borrowing is going down. And so if you go back to our chain of events with the money supply, what was M1 again? What's the composition of M1? Currency in circulation plus checking account deposits. Now, when money's held in the form of deposits, our fractional reserve system creates more deposits and therefore creates money, but that was all predicated on loaning out money, right? So that was the mechanism that allowed that money to be multiplied, is that banks get deposits in and they loan it out. If interest rates are going up, there's less loans going out, and therefore what happens to the money supply? If there's less loaning going out, less money supply. So that's the chain that we're kind of putting together here on the Fed affecting the money supply. So an increase in interest rates leads to a decrease in the money supply. And then vice versa would be true as well. So if the Fed changes the rate at which they give loans out at, that'll cause a decrease in the money supply. Okay, required reserves then is the fraction that has to be not loaned out, right? So the fraction of deposits that cannot be loaned out. This was from our table, the big RR, the required reserves. So if the Fed increases an increase in the required reserve ratio, would that lead to an increase or decrease in the money supply if the Fed is forcing banks to hold back? What would happen to the money supply? How many people say up? How many people say down?
Sorry, can you
Good.
repeat the-
Yes, it's down. So an increase in the required reserve ratio would decrease the money supply. Again, see how the tie to loans? Here we were using the interest rate as our tool to reduce loans essentially. And here we're using the required reserve ratio as our tool to reduce loans. So same kind of channel is going on of affecting ultimately the number of deposits that are in checking and savings accounts. Okay, any questions on that one? All right, these two don't get used very often. Now we're into the two that are going to be used more here. So number 3 is open market operations. Open market operations is the purchase and sale or sale of bonds I'll just leave it at that. I was going to maybe add on, but that's fine. Purchase and sale of bonds to influence the money supply. So this one's kind of weird. So now I got my props. So the story kind of starts off like this. I want you guys to pretend, Mary, you're going to be President Joe Biden today. Okay, so Mary has run out, Joe Biden has run out of funds. I'm going to be Jerome Powell, so this is a little role-playing exercise. Mary's Joe Biden, I'm Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve. You guys are the people of the United States, right? And maybe some of you are some investors. Okay, so does Joe have enough money to pay for spending this year? No, Joe never has enough money to pay for spending because they never collect enough taxes to pay for the spending. One of our other problems with government that we've faced. Again, not even putting too much blame on Joe here because every other president for the last 30, 40 years has done the same thing, right? So we're not collecting enough taxes. What kind of deficit did we call that? Was it the trade deficit or the fiscal deficit? Fiscal deficit. So the fiscal side of the house is kind of taxes and spending controlled by Congress and the president. All right, so Mary has a need for some money to pay for spending because she didn't collect enough taxes. So Joe writes up a bond and says, bond for sale, right? Joe goes to Wall Street and sells it. And so the bond goes into the free marketplace. Joe gets his money to now pay for weapons of mass destruction and whatever else. Okay, so everybody's cool with that part of the story? Now start passing that around. So the bond is active in the marketplace. There's another transaction, right? So Jesse's tired of it. She's like, for sale, bond for sale, right? This thing's circulating around the globe, by the way. But around to America, yeah, just keep passing it around. And so that thing's for sale. And then the Federal Reserve wants to make an open market purchase. All right, Nadia, if you can stop right there. So Jerome Powell says, hey, I want to change the money supply in the United States. And so I'm like, oh, I'll buy that. What did I just do? Increase or decrease the money supply? Increase. Nadia's holding the money now. I'm holding the bond. I'm Jerome Powell. I'm the central bank. So I just pulled the bond out of circulation, essentially, in the free market. So it's in the government's hands. And I just gave Nadia some money so that she can do her business. So that is an open market purchase. So we got two cases here. A purchase of bonds leads to an increase in the money supply. So now the Federal Reserve has on their balance sheet this bond. Now, by the way, there's something else going on here. Remember, Joe owes whoever's holding this bond the money for it. So how a bond works is that there's a face value. So originally, Joe needed $1 million, and it was a 5-year deal with $50,000 per year coming. So there was effectively kind of a 5% interest rate on this bond, right? It's just an IOU, piece of paper. Whoever's holding it, whether it's somebody in China, somebody in Germany, somebody in France, somebody in the United States, whoever has it is entitled to the interest payments coming from Joe. Is that clear? So notice what happens here is that Mary, Joe over here, sounds like we're having a Bible study or something. We got Mary and Joseph. So Mary has to pay whoever's holding it. Now, if Jerome is holding it, if the Federal Reserve is holding it, then Mary pays, and the bond goes away if it's paid off, or it's an interest payment. So over time, the Federal Reserve has actually been the most profitable enterprise for government entities because it's making money off these investments that it has. And so when it turns over a profit, though, ultimately it turns the money back over to the Treasury Department. So the US government still gets the profits back. It's not like it's accumulating profits and can dish them out in the form of pay raises or other things, so in theory. Okay, so that's kind of the process with the bonds and how the money supply is increased, and then how that obligation comes from the government.
So the government basically gets rid of the bond without paying an external party.
That's right.
So they're basically paying themselves.
Yes, that's right. So because one arm of the government is paying the other arm of the government, they're kind of monetizing that spending. Yes, yes. Okay. Any other questions so far? All right, so then of course we can do an open market sale. So a sale of bonds. Leads to, of course, a decrease in the money supply, just the opposite. So now if the Federal Reserve wants to restrict the money supply, which is what they're doing now, then they can go to the open market. Maybe we're just 2 years into this 5-year bond. And so now Jerome Powell can go to Wall Street and sell the bonds. So with an open market sale, now we have some money coming back in. The bond is back out in circulation. Caroline, I'll just have you holding on to that. So now the money's come back home, right? And so now I've pulled the money out of the circulating economy and it's back at the Federal Reserve. And so that's the decrease in the money supply, checking accounts, savings accounts, currency, whatever, that has come down. Yeah?
But isn't that pretty bad for the economy in general?
Why?
Because inflation is not necessarily a thing that you want to happen.
Okay. Yeah, so we'll talk more when we get into like next week's material on that, but your intuition's right. So we've talked about Zimbabwe and Venezuela and Argentina. And what do they do when they run out of tax dollars?
Print more.
Print more money, right? So we don't print money in the United States. So, right, we pay it off, inflation explodes, right? So we don't do that. We're too good for that in the United States, right? So we have the independence of the Fed. So if Joe Biden tells Jerome Powell, hey, make some more money, we got to get this economy cooking. I have an election coming up this fall against this Trump guy, and let's kind of make sure that people are feeling good and they have lots of spendable money. Jerome Powell can say to Joe Biden, so he's not his boss, right? The Federal Reserve is completely independent, in theory, of the Federal Reserve. So my confidence has been shaken in our system, especially from the COVID developments, but even prior to that, maybe into the financial crisis, the degree to which they are independent and one's not kind of facilitating the other. Maybe not explicitly, but in reality, what went on with COVID was the government spent a lot of money on those $1,500 checks, and so they were short a lot of money, and so they took $4 trillion. Where's my bond? Oh yeah, my bond's out in circulation. They took $4 trillion to pay for what I call the COVID bonds, basically bonds that helped pay for the government shortfalls because of all the policies really revolving around COVID, and they dumped them. But then what happened was the Federal Reserve immediately gobbled them up. And so the Federal Reserve pumped money into the system, and basically 1 to 2 to 3 years later, here we are, and we're paying for it with 10% inflation and higher rates. And so ultimately, what did really go on? If the government didn't collect enough taxes to pay for their spending, how did they effectively pay for the spending? What do you have to pay more for at the cash register now when you go get your groceries?
Everything.
Everything. So everybody was equally taxed an inflation tax. How does a flat tax work? Who gets hurt more, the poor or the rich? The poor. So think about our historic tax rate has been 2%, and if inflation rates went up to 10%, we had what's called basically an inflation tax of 8%, but that's a flat tax, right? Everybody pays. It would be like the government coming out, we're going to have a special tax of 8%. Everybody's got to pay 8% of their income. That's a bigger hit for the poor than it is for the rich, right? And so it's really an unfair situation for the government, in my opinion, my humble opinion, to use that mechanism to do it. And then what's worse is that they didn't really think they were doing that. They thought inflation, I mean, you can look through a whole litany of statements from the Federal Reserve chairs and the Treasury. Well, this inflation looks like it's just going to be temporary. It's just going to be a little bit of a phase. When we went up from like 3% to 4%, we're in kind of a transition phase. They seem to believe that somehow it was not going to work the way we're learning it works in economics class, when they effectively dump 40% more money, $4 trillion worth of money out into the system. Tim?
Yes, the president is not their boss, but doesn't the president and the Senate select the people who get to be in the Federal Reserve? Yeah,
they do, but that process is pretty good. You got, especially once you get to the Senate phase, they kind of vet out people, and usually they come with pretty good pedigrees and experience, either from the real world. So Wayne Angel had kind of a mix. He got his PhD in economics from KU, and then he came back to Ottawa, was professor for a while, and then he did different investing, and he owned a farm. And so there's people from a wide variety of backgrounds. Not all of them have been PhDs in economics. Most of them have been some sort of economics training in their background. But yeah, so I don't really have too big of a beef with that being some sort of, I'm not a big conspiracy theory type person. So my economics training says that to have coordinated behavior that's that big of a deal, I don't believe that there's something kind of intentional going on, but rather it's the unintended consequences of maybe people that think they know more than they can possibly know.
What's that? It's that thing where it's like the most obvious answer is probably the answer.
Yeah, I can't remember what that principle is, but yeah, could be at play here. Yeah.
It's less likely that's big overoption.
Yeah.
People just be stupid.
Yeah.
Getting out of this.
All right, so that is open market operations. So traditionally, this one is a very highly used one for the Federal Reserve. So this is a big one. All right, and then our last tool is the newest tool. Number 4 is the interest on reserves. Interest on reserves. Okay, so first of all, this was added in 2008, following the financial crisis. So the financial crisis, the Great Recession, was the 2008, and the powers to be, Ben Bernanke at the time, who was a PhD trained economist, is a PhD trained economist for that matter, thought this would be great to have another tool that would give them some more control. And the control that they were looking for was that, what's the lowest you could do with the discount rate? What do you think is the lowest rate you could possibly do? What's the
lowest
lower
you can
bound?
offer
Yeah.
or the least you
Can we have negative rates?
in theory.
Yeah, it's possible to do something, but that means they would be paying you to hold the money. So that, as far as the central bank, that doesn't really work. So we kind of face this lower bound of 0. With only so low could we bring the interest rates. And so that was the environment that the Fed was in. They thought they could do better than that, and they wanted a little more power. And so the power that they came up with was the ability to pay interest on reserves. All right, so this is the interest rate paid on deposits not loaned out. So the actual, and I haven't given you guys this term, sometimes it gets so confusing with them, but the actual reserves of the bank, kind of at any point in time, this idea of how much reserves are in the banking system, the actual reserves, this is a single bank. So we're not talking, for instance, I mentioned Wells Fargo here. So Wells Fargo, the actual reserves of Wells Fargo at any given point in time, so this could be today or yesterday, 4/16 of 24, on some particular day, the actual reserves of the bank is equal to its vault cash, which is cash in the drawers, basically cash not in circulation, right? It's inside the drawers of the bank, it's inside the vault, so vault cash, plus deposits at the Fed, being the banker's bank. All right, so prior to 2008, the banks didn't get any money off of their reserves. If they had money sitting as vault cash or money sitting at the Fed, there was no reserve, there was no money being made. So, kind of the key point, before 2008, bank did not make any money, maybe I should use the word profit, let's call it profit interest off of reserves, actual reserves. Okay, so then after 2008, they got paid an interest rate on both of these things. So after 2008, yeah, let me write that out first, I guess. After 2008, they get interest on all actual reserves. Now, I was hoping to make people more upset by kind of unearthing this, but I found people are just more complacent than I thought they would be. This part always made me mad. So you're telling me if I go put $1,000 at my bank right now, they're gonna start making money off my $1,000 right away, right? It's like they can make money off my cash, or better yet, I get my hard-earned paycheck of $750 and I deposit my check into my checking account. The bank pays me zero, but my government pays the rich bankers money on my checking account, my hard-earned money of $750. Why doesn't the government just pay me?
Because you're not paid.
So I'll come to questions here in a sec. Why don't they pay me? I want some of that money, right? And so they're paying the rich bankers, but not me. Anyway, so that was my rhetorical question of why I was upset. I'm like, it seems like they're just kind of feeding the banks, right? And so that was one issue with it. So what is the incentive of the bank under the old system? If before 2008, the bank couldn't make any money off of money they held back, what did they have to do to make money? Loans, right? So they need the old-fashioned way is, hey, you put your money at the bank, they loan it out. So one of the big factors here, so another key point, to make money, profit, prior to 2008, banks would loan out all excess reserves, or basically all of them, to businesses and other who they thought were a good risk. Who they thought were a good risk for a loan. So the data shows this pretty clearly, that prior to 2008, all excess money outside of the required reserves that was set by the Fed, which was about 10%, by the way. So the required reserve ratio was approximately, on average, 10%. And then sometimes they'd raise it or lower it, and it's actually in reality a little more complicated than that, but that's simple enough conceptually at this point. So they would loan out all this money. All right, so then after the interest rate on reserves policy was in, they stopped loaning out as much money as they used to. So, but after 2008, they quit loaning out as much because they got risk-free interest from the Fed. Okay, so, all right, the plot thickens in here. So, any questions so far? So what grew was deposits at the Fed. Yeah, Jesse?
Yeah, my earlier comment, the banks are getting this deal because, well, they're bankrolling the candidates' campaigns. So.
No, I don't want to even get down that road. You know, there might be some, but they try to be careful with campaign contributions and stuff. But yeah, that's possible that there's, you know, some of that going on. But that's not the main issue here.
Not the main one, but
Yeah.
it's like the glaringly obvious thing that could be happening.
Yeah. Who knows? Maybe. I haven't seen any evidence to support that. But here's the evidence I have seen. So they've got this extra money. So deposits at the Fed grow. Deposits at the Fed grow. These deposits are essentially your checking and savings account balances. Deposits at the Fed grow. These are basically your checking and savings accounts. Your checking and savings accounts not being loaned out. Not being loaned out to private businesses and households. So if they're not being loaned out here, where are they being loaned out to? So there's money sitting on the Fed's balance sheet. There's more deposits at the Fed. They used to be loaned out to private businesses and households, like you guys wanting to buy homes and cars and businesses expanding their business. Who's getting the money now? Tim? The government. Mary's doing it. It all comes back to Joe. So now, in combination with tool number 3, the Fed is putting your checking and savings account balances to work. But they're not feeding Pizza Village on Main Street a new loan to open up a pizza place. or expand their business. They're giving it to Joe Biden. And so they are doing then open market purchases with their additional funds on their balance sheet, and they're buying up government bonds. And so now, instead of the money being out in the private sector, it's going towards government. So let me write that on the board and then I'll go to questions here. So these are basically to not being loaned out. They are now loaned out to the government through the purchase of bonds by the Fed. And I think we've been kind of snookered, and I don't think a lot of people know about it. So this is what I presented in Vegas a couple weeks ago, and I wrote an article about it about a year ago, and I can't seem to catch fire, and it hasn't gotten me fired yet, or dead. I have been wondering if there's going to be some black Escalades or something that show up sometime. So, no, I don't really believe that. So that's just a joke, I think. So, but I think they've successfully figured out a way to use our checking and savings accounts that were previously devoted towards private enterprise, private businesses. And so my main beef with all of this, because I got challenged at the conference a little bit about, well, what would you want to do? Remember that those other tools were in the shed. So just so that you know, if the Fed wanted to stop the loaning out business, they could raise the required reserve ratio. That's what they usually did. So they would raise the required reserve ratio, and they still had a tool to be able to, slow down the economy in that way. And so now the way they're doing it is through this interest on reserves, and they raise the interest rate. So the interest rate right now that the Fed is paying banks on their vault cash and deposits is 5.4%. They're getting 5.4%. That's a pretty good interest rate. So the Fed is trying to slow down the growth of money, and this is the tool that they're using. But the result of that again might have been unintended, although these guys are pretty smart, so I'm not sure it was that we have shifted $4 trillion into government decisions, relying on Congress and Joe to decide where your money goes, rather than private businesses and households. So what the data shows is that the difference is about $4 trillion that's now sitting with government loans. Now, if you guys feel good about what the government does with their money versus what many businesses around the world do with their money, if you're indifferent between those two things, then this is no big deal, right? So, but I don't think funneling more power and funds into government is a good idea. I would rather see the money distributed in a decentralized way to thousands of businesses and households in the United States. Some of them are going to make dumb loans, some of them are going to make good loans, some of them are going to make the new latest greatest gizmo, and some of them are going to be complete failures. But through that process of free enterprise and entrepreneurship, the country will be in a better place 5 to 10 years from now with economic growth than what we would be if we were funneling this over to Joe Biden and the central government doing whatever they do with the money. All right, questions, Tim?
I mean, as $4 trillion is almost a fifth of our GDP.
Yeah, good, I'm glad. So, yeah, Tim was reminding, $4 trillion, the whole GDP is around 20-some trillion, right? So, yeah, we're at a fourth or a fifth, somewhere in that range, yeah.
Are the taxes at least getting lower because of that? Because now the government has more budget?
No. Yeah, there's no tax no tax cuts on the horizon. I don't even think, or I haven't heard one thing about, Trump was successful at getting some of tax rates lowered and simplified during his first few terms. The little bit of rhetoric, and I'm dreading even hearing the rhetoric going on into the summer and to the fall. But I haven't heard much about some sort of tax decrease. So I don't think that's on the horizon. There's other issues that seem to be hot buttons now. Jesse?
What do you think the chances are of the government ever willingly and peacefully doing away with these laws and changes?
Close to zero.
Unfortunate.
Yeah, close to zero, and that's just the practical part of me. My mom was definitely a pragmatist. So I could lay out a good argument, but at the end of the day, the people in power are going to do everything to keep the power, right? And so once Bernanke in 2008 was able to pass this, by the way, this interest on reserves was a kind of a contested issue of them using this policy. So there was people kind of for and against, and then you'll see that people in power are able to kind of use a crisis to their advantage. And so the 2008 financial crisis, they're like, oh, look at, if we would have had this, we could have done this differently, and they actually accelerated the adoption of the policy. I think it was supposed to come into play in 2010, and they were able to accelerate that policy. They probably would have been able to push it through eventually anyway. If you look at the picture, if we have rational ignorance by you guys and the rest of the general public, remember, I'm all for rational ignorance. I think you should be rationally ignorant on a lot of things. What was rational ignorance again?
It's
Tim, I saw his hand first.
It's not seeing any benefit of voting.
Okay, not seeing any, yeah, that was related to the voting part, that's right. So the benefits of voting don't seem to outweigh the cost of voting, right, of staying informed. And so the general public, you guys don't want to, your moms and dads and everybody else, they're going to gloss over on this whole thing, right? You guys are glossing over. Some of you got your antenna in there a little bit more, but this is just not something that the average person is going to care about. Do you think the bankers like this policy? The owners of banks? Do you think they like this policy? Oh yeah. And do you think the Federal Reserve people like this policy? Yeah. Do you think Joe Biden and Congress kind of like this policy? Yeah. So it's next to nothing that we have even a flying chance of getting this changed. So all the people in power like this policy. The bankers get this money, and so they're happy for their individual interest, their self-interest. And so there's not really anybody other than little old Russ McCullough from little old Ottawa, Kansas, that's got the battle cry out in a sea of 330 million people. So yeah, close to zero. I don't want to say zero. I got to have a little bit of hope, but yeah, 0.00000000001 chance of it passing. So, got another?
Would this ever come apart by itself, like the death by 1,000 cuts you mentioned earlier?
That's a good question. I think they could kind of freeze the policy. I don't know if eventually the death by 1,000 cuts, there's a lot of other things that are falling apart in addition to this, so that might just be related to it. Yeah. All right, so let's see, where did we leave this off here? So government loan out, I did want to put on the current level of the interest rate. All right, so currently, current interest on reserves. In fact, maybe I'll start to warm up the screen here. Show you guys that thing I did in Vegas that'll make a little more sense now. Current interest on reserves is 5.4%. And I have estimated that private loans have been crowded out by government loans by $4 trillion.
Should we take notes on this too?
No, I think you've got the notes that you need down that we had, but I've got a couple graphs that I wanted to show you with the rate. So you guys basically got this presentation, so with the incentives and how they can use the reserves, I kind of, have a little fun with Bernanke. Maybe he was the chair of the Federal Reserve back in 2008 that put this into play. And this is the level of deposits of the banking system over time. So you can see it's a pretty steady climb here. And currently at 17.6 trillion is the amount of your deposits, checking and savings and money market accounts, right? M2 essentially. But this is the level of deposits, not actually M2 that we're measuring. And then this is from your book. So what's being measured here is the required reserves plus currency. That was this part that I've already erased over here. So the reserves in the system, and what it showed was that prior to 2008, banks loaned out all of their excess reserves. And then as soon as that policy changed, boom, that jumped up and they're like, oh, we can make money off people's, money that we don't loan out? Okay, I'll take some of that money. And so it really substantially grew here over time. And the M1 is the money supply. So this is currency and checking account deposits. And you can see they kind of went in harmony with each other, but then they started to diverge over time. So here is the monetary base, which I haven't defined on the board, but it is reserves plus currency. So we refer to it as the monetary base when we look at it as the whole country's supply of reserves plus currency in circulation. And so now, with this change, if I apply, here was my reasoning on deducing the $4 trillion from private. Let's pretend we're with the old policy. If that's the case, and it had been 10%, if we apply that 10% to the 17.6 trillion of deposits, then that means banks would have been loaning out 15.8 trillion to private households and businesses. And so today, the monetary base is 5.9, which means we have 4 trillion that's not going into private hands, but rather going to Mary, right? It's going towards government spending. And so that's the part that I have the biggest beef of, that I think will have some long-term consequences over time. Here is that interest on reserves. Now notice this goes back to just 2022. And one of the things I kind of state with my argument is that the interest on reserves was basically next to nothing or less than 1% since 2008. So I don't think it was really on people's radar screens that, oh, this new policy. I mean, to be honest with you, it was such a negligible thing. I taught you guys back in 2009, 10, 11, I just did 3 tools of the Fed. I didn't even put the interest on reserves because it was new and we weren't sure how it was working. And then all of a sudden it was sticking around and it finally made it into the textbooks. And so for a while there, it was kind of a nothing burger, right? If it's less than 1% and people don't seem to care about it. But now I start climbing these stairs and I'm like, what? The banks are getting 5%? The banks are getting 5.4%? So this is the current policy, brings us up to present day of the 5.4% with the changes. And you can see these discrete jumps are when they have their policy meeting. Remember they're meeting like every 6 weeks, the Federal Open Market Committee, and then they're changing the policy. And then it goes on for a while, and then they change the policy on that date. And so that's why you get these kind of stair-step jumps. All right, any questions there? Yeah.
Could this be also why housing seems more expensive nowadays?
It was probably, housing is interest rate sensitive, so to the degree that's there, yes. With easy money policies before, yes. Yeah, it's possible. All right, so here's the treasury securities that banks used to hold. So what I was a little concerned about when I first did it was that banks would hold US treasuries as part of their portfolio too. Instead of loaning them out, they could have bought government bonds. And so I was a little bit concerned of, well, maybe they quit buying bonds and then the Fed did it, but that turned out not to be true. So their holdings of bonds. So this, by the way, is Fred, which we might use a little bit more here as we get into these final chapters. This is the Federal Reserve website that is free to the public, and they make these little graphs and all these economic variables we've been talking about in macro class, and you can look up housing prices, you can look up Kansas unemployment rates, just a pretty awesome database. So I've been a little hard on the Federal Reserve, but I like the way they're at least keeping the data, and people like me can do this. Like, if you're in other countries around the world where the regime is a little more oppressive, do they want guys like me speaking out against the government? No. So God bless America. Like I said, hopefully the 5 black Escalades at some point will come. I don't think they will. I don't think they will. But that's a luxury that we have in the United States, you know, with freedom of speech and all of that stuff. So my point is that the government does give us this data. So in that way, they're kind of transparent about what they're doing, right? Kind of. But it seems like a lot of smoke and mirrors with this new policy to me, so I'm not sure they're super transparent. All right, so here's the part, some funny things that have come up. I told you that the Federal Reserve was profitable over the years, right? Because they held onto these bonds. But now think about what's going on. The government's holding $4 trillion, the Federal Reserve is holding this. Joe Biden has to pay for this. So Joe Biden has to pay an interest payment, right? This is interest on the national debt that we'll kind of talk about next week and later too. But check out what happens. Joe Biden pays the interest to Jerome Powell, but then Jerome Powell pays it to Wells Fargo. The money just kind of passes through the Fed, right? Before, what happened was the money stayed with Jerome Powell, and the Federal Reserve made money off this interest. But then they just kind of turned the interest back over. But now what's happening is it's kind of this pass-through effect where the interest on reserves is probably approximately equal to the government borrowing rate. And so what's happened now is they're losing money. Losing a lot of money for the first time because the money that Joe Biden is paying in is less than what they're paying out to the banks. And so it's causing the Federal Reserve to lose some money. All right, so that's kind of an interesting thing. And then they create this deferred asset. Don't worry, it does not affect the Federal Reserve's ability to conduct monetary policy. I love this last thing, or to meet its financial obligations. So don't worry, we're just doing some accounting. You wouldn't understand it anyway, right? Now it is true though that that doesn't affect them meeting their monetary obligations. Why? What can the Federal Reserve do if they run out of money? Hey, you need some money, right? So they kind of always hold that card. Now here's another one that's on the books. So the Federal Reserve, this is as of 2/15, this almost makes me laugh now. This was from their website, so I got this right from their website. Does not purchase new Treasury securities directly from the Treasury. And this is not a means of financing the federal deficit. I'm calling BS on that. I mean, come on. What went on? Now this was published in 2015, but what really went on when Joe had to print off the COVID bonds because they didn't collect enough was they dumped a bunch of these bonds on the market and the Fed gobbled them up using our checking and savings accounts to fund that. All right, so let's see. I'm gonna skip that one. So here's the pass-through. So they get it, the banks love it, and the long-term economic growth suffers, the slow bleed, the death by 1,000 cuts. And here's my final recommendation. Drop the mic. See you tomorrow.